Jamaica's second National Biodiversity Conference. I'd like to thank you for joining us wherever you are in the virtual world, and for those of us who are here with us. Let me quickly recognize the participants at the head table. You heard from Ms. Simone Lloyd already, but I'd like to recognize the Honorable Pernell Charles Jr., Minister of MUREC, Dr. Alwyn Ailes, CDJP, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency, the British High Commissioner.
A protected area of 134 hectares using 50 buoys and to grow 1,000 pieces of staghorn corals in 5 nurseries.
The White River project is unique in that their project is in the White River. And so before they started, they had to get permits, beach permits from Nepal. And this took a while, but because of the persistence of their project manager, Belinda Morrow, they were able to pursue it, and finally they got it, and so they began the project.
Representing Her Excellency, the British High Commissioner.
Done some intercropping with Scotch bonnet peppers.
It had taken some work to secure the land in Colbeck St. Catherine, but soon after that, he got a climate smart loan from JN Small Business Loans through their climate change adaptation line of credit, and he was ready to go. He got his team together and jumped into planting his first crop of onions for a growing market.
This is where we sow the seed. So when we get this now, we transplant them in the farm.
He was particularly happy that through the loan, he had an irrigation system which would allow him to better fight the drought that was affecting Jamaica. Fast forward to May 2017.
We had actually experienced 3 floods on this farm. We lost crops due to the rain in the early stages. That was within 2 to 3 weeks after they were planted.
Who is representing Her Excellency, the British High Commissioner.
Interventions by Randy and his team helped him not to lose everything, but they have all learned some lessons from
that this is a protected area and there's no fishing allowed inside here.
Research shows that Jamaica's fish catches
Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner,
Small business loans.
Mr. Finnegan, as a part of his project, he produces a number of crops, but specifically for this particular
who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner, Mr. Oliver Blake, who is representing Her Excellency the British High Commissioner,
try and do something to earn an additional income for themselves. We chose to make flour. We have our own traditional sweet potato pudding mix. We also make a gluten-free dumpling mix. We make plantain porridge mix, and of course we have the flours, the straight flour, cassava, breadfruit, sweet potato. The AP and FM financing was to build a refrigerator. We store our potatoes in there. And then now we use the production center behind us to do our wet work and our drying. We started off, myself and production manager Daniel, working 3 or 4 days a month. And now we have a group of 7 or 8 part-timers, and we work every day, right? We make 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of flour a month.
The production process is pretty simple. It's potatoes coming in from the field. It's washed, sliced, peeled, dried. They bring them in a chip form, and those chips go through the mill and comes out flour. Here at Jeton Products, our facility is solar powered.
The greenhouse project was part of the AP and FM grant fund through the EFJ. So we have a greenhouse that needed to be moved from one point to another, and to build a water catchment base, storage base, to supply that greenhouse, plus another greenhouse that we had. So the one that the project really funded was very, very successful. And we are in the process now to restart undercropping in there.
The Jeffreytown Farmers Association has received a number of local and international awards over the years, including the Equator Prize for promoting local sustainable development solutions. It is increasing climate resilience through community-driven efforts.
It's helping food security in that way and helping livelihoods, actual cash flow in your pocket, helps build resilience in a community.
Our whole endeavor with all the projects that we've done is about climate resilience. And I believe personally that we have to do more protective agriculture, like greenhouse farming.
Innovation is key in adding value to products.
We were the first in Jamaica to produce the sweet potato pudding mix, where we add our value, make it into a packet that you can just add water and bake a pudding in a short space of time.
I think it's a good idea to be innovative. I think you need to think through the process to make certain that your ideas can come to fruition. You want to see that there's a niche for what you can do and what you can deliver. And even if you're doing the same as somebody else, there must be demand for what you are doing so that you can fit in. So you have to have an income-generating activity that is sustainable, can hold its place in the market, and can maintain the assets of the association or the group.
And what are some of the lessons that have been learned?
Utilize the people that have the expertise before you implement or put in a project or apply for a project.
The most important thing is to be honest, to work hard, and to build a decent reputation, because people will help you if they see that you are working towards a sensible and attainable goals.
Don't allow your goal to be directed by outside voices. Find your niche product, find something different, fit a gap, find something that makes sense and is viable and can help you.
Have a plan. You must have a roadmap for where you really want to go and keep plugging at it. Experience has taught us to be very wary of the tradesmen you use to deliver your projects for you. It's important to remember that the cheapest is not always the best. You need to get reputable people to produce.
In our community.
We are so excited about it because it's the first we have seen something like this.
Aquaponics combines fish farming with soilless crop production. InMed Partnerships for Children was contracted by the AP&FM to provide technical support for 5 communities to get their aquaponics systems built and operational. InMed is an international non-profit organization working on climate-smart agriculture and opportunities for sustainable livelihoods.
We were contracted to build out these systems and provide training to ensure their successes. It will be a social enterprise that will provide profits to the community.
The aquaponics farm is climate-smart agriculture. It entails using fish to fertilize crops. So the fish are stored in tanks. The water is pumped from the fish tanks into the grow beds. The gravel in the grow beds filter the water. The roots trap the fertilizer, and the filtered water goes back to the fish. So it's a recycling process that is called a closed loop.
It's taking you from the traditional farming method
and showing you something new, an easier way, a shorter period of time to cultivate it.
The process is supposed to yield double the production of traditional farming.
Whatever the environment is, this has a controlled setup. You can earn more, produce more, not just fish, but also vegetables. And it is a win-win because it is also environmentally friendly.
The crops are clean. We have no soil to contend with, and we use less chemicals. The chemicals we use are bio-friendly because they have to be bio-friendly for the fish.
Apart from having healthy food, we use up less land space and we also use less workmanship.
The farmers have been growing lettuce, pak choy, scallion, and strawberries. The Rural Agricultural Development Authority, RADA, provides extension services and training to farmers across the country.
We at RADA believe that farming is a business, and as such we
So what we want to do is to create a no-take zone, the idea being that that within that area the fish population would come back, and so by doing that, that would help the reef to come back because the reef helped the fish. And in addition, we would grow some corals, so we'd restore the reef as well.
The sanctuary covers 150 hectares of coral reef, seagrass beds, and sand from Hermosa Cove to Prospect. It is operated by the White River Fishermen Association and the White River Marine Association. They are all pushing to see a 500% increase in the fish size and the numbers in the next 5 years. Success indicators include increase in fish stock and coral coverage, healthier marine life and beaches, and better shoreline resilience for coastline settlements. The project implementing team was excited to share some of the progress made, including the sanctuary being patrolled 24 hours daily by the WRFA fishers employed as wardens, and the coral nurseries being cleaned twice per month by fishers employed as coral gardeners.
Those coral gardeners themselves, they are trained up fishermen that are trained to be divers, PADI certified divers, and then trained scientifically by local scientists to go out and take care of the corals themselves. They've assisted us in ensuring that we have what we call demarcation buoys, which are buoys that are out there very visible, and they basically say to everybody, fisherman, non-fisherman, anybody that's into the sport, that this is a protected area and there's no fishing allowed inside here.
Research shows that Jamaica's fish catches are down 600% since 1950.
When we used to fishing at first, you could catch big fishes. Now it moved down to inch and a half size now. That most of the fishermen are catching inch and a half fish, half-inch fish, and when you go out there, it's like almost no fish.
The project was funded by the Special Climate Change Adaptation Fund. The fund is administered by the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica for the Adaptation Program and the financing mechanism of the Pilot Program for Climate Change Resilience.
That project funds the coral gardeners, which are key persons in ensuring that those actual corals grow. It funds us to go in. Buoy maintainers.
We get a training how to patrol. We caught a lot of people because some of them say they didn't know that it is open. Some didn't take it serious, but for everybody, we give them a first warning. We have a contact with the water police if somebody decide to.
Gardening, which is a means of livelihood that we see that is a viable alternative, and this experience will provide a good example for other coastal villages to implement climate change measures that deal with
because trust me, at 30 odd years I do fishing. And me know what a sanctuary can bring. It motivates me a lot. So me as a warden now, me love it and want to be a part of it.
We have to thank God for it because it have done a great thing in White River and it is a big upliftment. And I feel that the fish there will grow.
Situation. The Adaptation Program and Financing Mechanism, AP&FM, for the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, PPCR, through the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica, EFJ, has funded efforts to build the resilience of communities such as Jeffreytown in St. Mary.
Jet-time products. Women wanted to try and do something to earn an additional income for themselves. We chose to make flour. We have our own traditional sweet potato pudding.
Excellency, British High Commissioner of Jamaica, Her Excellency, I apologize, Judith Slater, British High Commissioner to Jamaica, to bring remarks. Mr. Blake.
Mr. Chairman, Honourable Minister, Permanent Secretary, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very pleased to be the British High Commissioner to Jamaica. And bright blue sea.
The process is pretty simple. It's potatoes coming in from the field. It's washed, sliced, peeled, dry. They bring them in a chip form, and those chips go through the mill and comes out flour. Here at Jeton Products, our facility is solar powered.
The Greenhouse Project was part of the AP and FM grant fund through the EFJ. So we have a greenhouse that needed to be moved from one point to another, and to build a water catchment base, storage base, to supply that greenhouse, plus another greenhouse that we had. So the one that the project really funded was very, very successful. And we are in the process now to restart undercropping in there.
The Jeffreytown Farmers Association has received a number of local and international awards over the years, including the Equator Prize for promoting local sustainable development solutions. It is increasing climate resilience through community-driven efforts.
It's helping food security in that way.
Our
living in
best
harmony with
resources
nature.
is our
Having
people
collectively
and our
abused
land
our
that
natural
we
heritage
have.
for so long,
And the conditions, as
now
bad
is
as
the
the
time to
weather
put in
is,
place
we
long-term
can survive.
sustainable
It's
action
only
to
up for
protect
us
our oceans.
to allow the
And
people
in so
to
doing,
utilize
we will
the
find that we
space
also
they have.
protect ourselves.
To represent her in this, our second biodiversity, National Biodiversity Conference. And as I said earlier, we would like to thank the British government for the ongoing support that we receive to conserve our biodiversity. Thank you very much. Let's invite you to view remarks by Miss Elizabeth Marima, Executive Secretary, Convention on Biological Diversity. Miss Marima.
Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse threaten the progress that has been made towards sustainable development goals, especially in small island states in which the biodiversity and climate crises are already being acutely experienced. We are now at the precipice of this great challenge, but this is also an opportunity to move toward a path of sustainability and achieve our ambition of living in harmony with nature. As you know, this is the vision behind the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the 4 goals of the framework, which in their draft form include enhancing the integrity of all ecosystems with an increase of at least 15% in the area, connectivity, and integrity of natural ecosystems, supporting healthy and resilient populations of all species, reducing the rate of extinctions by at least 10-fold, halving the risk of species extinctions across all taxonomic and functional groups, and safeguarding the genetic diversity of wild and domesticated species, maintaining at least 90% of genetic diversity within all species, halting or reversing the increase in the extinction rate and reducing the extinction risk by at least 10%, with a decrease in the proportion of species that are threatened, and enhancing or at least maintaining the abundance and distribution of populations of species, ensuring that nature's contributions to people are valued, maintained, or enhanced through conservation and sustainable use, supporting the global development agenda for the benefit of all, and that the benefit from the utilization of genetic resources are shared fairly and equitably, with a substantial increase in both monetary and non-monetary benefits shared, including for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. These goals represent the outcome that we want for the world. However, in order to achieve these global outcomes, there will be need to be a nationalization of the Global Biodiversity Framework goals and targets, accompanied by national strategies, actions, and thus implementation. This includes continuing the progress that is already being made through the implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. This national forum, which aims to look at how Jamaica can move toward living in harmony with nature through identifying issues, challenges, and solutions, is an excellent example of how a country can already be thinking of delivering on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I am impressed by the initiative and dedication that have gone into making this forum a success. I commend you on this endeavor to translate the Global Biodiversity Framework into national ambition, targets, and actions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ms. Marima very much for that message. Ladies and gentlemen, participants, this second National Biodiversity Conference is rich. You hear it in the remarks that we have already received, and what we need to do is to develop strategies and action plans to implement these ideas. And we are also happy that Jamaica is recognized for the work we're doing in conserving our biodiversity. I'd like now to invite a Caribbean man, our friend, from St. Lucia, from Trinidad to St. Lucia, to Nairobi, back to Kingston. Our friend Vincent Sweeney, who is the head of the Caribbean Sub-Regional Office, United Nations Environment Program. Vincent, welcome Vincent Sweeney.
I'm very pleased to welcome you to Jamaica's National Biodiversity Conference, which is hosted this year under the theme, Living in Harmony with Nature, Issues, Challenges, and Solutions. Jamaica, as a small island developing state, is vulnerable both ecologically and economically to ecosystem loss and the resulting climate change impacts. Island biodiversity, such as what is found in Jamaica, is often endemic and therefore is extremely vulnerable to changes in or loss of ecosystems. Our economy depends heavily on protecting the biodiversity and habitats of this island. We are seeing the beginning of a new decade, and with that brings new challenges that we must face. Almost every aspect of lives, whether we realize it or not, is dependent on our biodiversity and ecosystems. The post-2020 biodiversity framework outlines a transformative, ambitious plan to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 and create a more nature-positive world. Governments, businesses, civil society, and individuals all have their part to play if we are to meet the framework targets. If we are to truly live in harmony with nature, the goals of this framework need to be a priority for each participant in this conference. The Bridgetown Declaration, made this year at the 22nd Forum of Ministers of the Environment for Latin America and the Caribbean, recall the importance of including biodiversity protection and ecosystem restoration in our efforts to build back better after the coronavirus pandemic. It is necessary for us to keep this in mind now as we continue to fight the effects of this pandemic. Our plans to build back better must take into account Jamaica's unique environmental and biodiversity needs. This year, Jamaica also marked the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The decade represents a call to action that we must meet. Events such as this conference represent key opportunities to pull together to stimulate sustainable change. Only through a community effort can we achieve the seemingly impossible task of bending the curve on biodiversity loss and bringing back plants and animals from the brink of extinction. I would therefore like to extend my gratitude to all attendees for committing to coming together and working to be part of the solution to one of the most vital challenges facing our society today. On behalf of the UN Environment Program, I wish you a successful and inspiring conference. Thank you for your time.
Thank you too.
I would therefore like to extend my gratitude to all attendees for committing to coming together and working to be part of the solution to one of the most vital challenges facing our society today. On behalf of the UN Environment Program, I wish you a successful and inspiring conference. Thank you for your time.
Thank you too, Vincent, for your remarks. And as I said, Vincent is a Caribbean man. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to invite the Honorable Minister to come to the podium to address us. But I would like to say that having sat there and listened to the remarks, including remarks I made about policy action and strategies, the need to mobilize resources, we have as our Minister of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment and Climate Change, the Honorable Pernell Charles Jr., who will come to the podium to address us. Minister Charles.
Thank you, Brother Knight. I'm listening to you, and it looks like you're going to be running a church at some time. You sound like a good pastor. But let me say good morning to everyone. I'm acknowledging, of course, those on the platform with me, including our permanent secretary, our CEO of NEPA, Brother Clark, representing our High Commissioner, Blake, representing our High Commissioner. I've noticed that CTD is always working and never finds herself on the platform, but I've sent you a message asking you why you're not up here. And everyone who's with us, the head of GIS and others. Of course, we couldn't do this without the expert services that we're receiving from those behind the scene, as well as our national icon over there that allows us to communicate with as many Jamaicans as possible. The importance of this conference should not be understated. And I want to thank CTD Guthrie and her team and all who have contributed to putting this together, Peter, because you know, we have a tendency to care more about our car, about our clothes, even the phone, than we do the living things around us. And it is important for us to take the opportunity to inform the nation on what biodiversity is, what the ecosystems are. These are not just scientific terms that sound like some kind of foreign language. These are terms that are critical to us understanding how best to live on this planet, how best to maximize how we interact, how we protect, how we preserve. And I want to say thank you to our poet, laureate, esteemed Olive Senior, for honoring us by participating as a special invited guest at this conference, and all the sponsors and partners who understand the importance of the discussion around biodiversity. Because I'm telling you, Permanent Secretary, for many, when they hear national biodiversity, they don't even bother to listen to it. Because it seems like it's just Peter Knight and his people at NEPA who understand what it is. But we want to break it down so you get the importance. Food security, water security, your own peace, being able to walk out into the gardens, being able to carry your spouse or your children to play. It is important for us to take care of our environment. It is important for us to understand the connection between protecting the plants and animals that are in Jamaica and nowhere else. Because everything on this earth has a specific responsibility and a role. And so we appreciate the gifts of nature, the rain, the sunshine, and the diversity of the animals and plants that we are blessed with on this earth, especially Jamaica. Unfortunately, it is we who have caused those same living organisms that we depend on to suffer at our hands. And that is why so many species have been completely wiped out, extinct. Flora, fauna, and others are now put at serious risk. According to the report from the United Nations Environment Programme, 20% of all vertebrate species are threatened with extinction, while coral reefs are declining. The number of dead zones in the oceans are rising rapidly. And how does that connect to me if I live in Rocky Point or if I live in Hellshire? Well, the coral reefs are the rock structures that nature has provided to protect the land because it breaks the water. And so when you stay on the beach and you skim the stone and you look out and you see sometimes the waves crashing way out there, they're crashing on the coral reef, and it stops that heavy magnitude of wave to come onto the shore. It's God's plan, and we are messing up the plan. And this conference is one of the mechanisms that we use to inform people how they can, one, stop messing up God's plan, and two, get on board with ensuring that we are protecting what we have been provided with, and find that way of maximizing the potential of using our plants and animals without abusing our plants and animals, including us. Remember, we are animals. I had this discussion, Mr. Knight, with my daughter, who is 11, and explaining that we humans are part of that system. And that is one of the issues too. Human beings have caused themselves to believe that we are so mighty that we don't need anything else. Once we have the phone and the iPad, once we have a stove and a TV, and we can go to courts and buy things, we're good. Because we are not contemplating living years from now in a space where the weather events have so intensified that you can't use and the TV and the phone because the poles are down. So we have to think about the connections and the interconnections between our biological diversity and our life. It is the United Nations Secretary General who said, biological diversity resources are the pillars upon which we build civilizations. Adding, for example, that fish provide 20% of animal protein to about 3 billion people, while over 80% of human diet is provided by plants. What will we do if we continue to reduce food security and also continue to pollute our oceans, which is causing the fish to die? What will happen then to the 3 billion people who are relying on fish and other animal as 20% of the animal protein? So those connections are what I'm trying to ensure us to make. And the preservation then of our biological diversity or biodiversity is critical to the preservation of our own life, our own natural history, our culture, our way of life. Look on Hope Gardens. I remember as a youngster, not too long ago, by the way, I remember my mother would carry me to Hope Gardens because I wouldn't stay still in the house. And it's not like now where Abigail Smythe and everyone is just phones and iPad and these things. But then you had to break glass and kick ball and catch things outside and make bow and arrow. And so I'd go to Hope Gardens because she found it a place of serenity. And that's where we would study. And so it's also about you being able to protect and preserve the history, the culture, the spaces that become spiritual places, the places where you can find peace. What will we continue to destroy our ecosystems if we continue to simply abuse what is around us, what's given to us as gifts? And so the transformative actions that are necessary to put the planet on a pathway towards resilient and sustainable development do not come easy. It has to be deliberate efforts on our part, collective commitment on our part, increased global ambition on our part. The future we want, living in harmony with nature. And I had the pleasure of attending the virtual format of the recently held 15th Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, as our global community continues to work towards the conclusion of negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And I must pause to acknowledge the presence of one of his co-chairs. Is that CTD? Mr. Basil Van, should I even try the last name? How do you say it? Have, of Canada. And we are indeed fortunate to have you as one of the presenters at the conference. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me not take too much time. What is needed is increased momentum if we are to successfully implement the new ambitious global biodiversity targets by 2030. Implementation needs to be carried out at the community, national, regional and international levels. And due consideration also needs to be given to environmental vulnerability in regard to the provision of concessional financing for development in line with our key standards and our key objectives towards the Agenda 2030. Now, for small countries like Jamaica, this discussion is even more important, I am certain that we understand how critical our unique features are to our tourism product. And by protecting and preserving our biodiversity, we are welcoming persons who are attracted to this kind of, not just the look, but those who understand the importance of ecotourism, for instance, of the ecological balance. You have a whole new sector of the tourism, that we can be able to exploit in a positive way. Persons who want to go on hikes and who want to go on trails and who just want to travel to spaces where they can see animals and plants that are indigenous. So we have greater opportunity in Jamaica if we are to go on this pathway towards sustainability and resilience. And indeed, our own Professor Dale Webber, who's the principal of the UA Mona campus and the chair of my Climate Change Advisory Board, he noted that over 8,000 species of plants and animals had been recorded here in our country, and that Jamaica ranked fifth in the world in terms of endemic species. How many of you knew that? You knew that? I never knew that either. But the reality is, that means we have a competitive advantage, and we have to maximize our competitive advantage. So protecting our plants and animals is not just throwing out a phraseology like that. No. By protecting our plants and animals, we are protecting our tourism product. We are protecting livelihoods for our people. We're protecting food. And we're not saying that you can't utilize plants and animals, Mr. Knight. What we're saying is do so in a way that allows us to regenerate, allows us to be sustainable in our practices. So we must reduce the several threats to our ecosystems, and biodiversity, including the change in land use, including pollution, encroachment on natural habitats, burning, the hunting and the harvesting of endemic species. It must stop. The black-billed parrot and other exotic pets, over-harvesting of our fish. It's just not a smart way to approach life. Getting everything now and having nothing later, that's nonsensical. That is you putting your children and their children in a position which is disadvantageous. And so, given all those factors, rehabilitation and restoration of degraded and vulnerable ecosystems has been identified as a national and international priority. And we know that tree cutting, illegal tree cutting, is one of the issues that we have targeted, as well as also looking on the illegal quarrying and also illegal settling, because all of these things impact on our ecosystem. I want to point quickly to our interconnectedness between biodiversity loss and one of its main drivers, which is climate change. You know that I could not come and not speak specifically to the issue. One of the issues is our use of fossil fuels for energy, which has polluted the atmosphere and is actively and rapidly turning the planet into a greenhouse. Ecosystems are extremely sensitive to the impacts of climate change, with the most vulnerable areas being our coral reefs, our forests, our coastal wetlands, including the mangroves. And these are all areas we depend on. Those mangroves that you speak of are the spaces that provide the environment for our fish to flourish. That's where the fish go into and create fish sanctuaries and make their babies because they're protected from all of the harsh weather. So when we look and we say, boy, it's just bush. It's not just bush. The roots and the leaves and the interconnectedness and interweaving is what God wanted to create a shelter. So when we go in and we over-harvest, what we do is we destroy what our children will need tomorrow, which is nonsensical. And so these areas that are extremely sensitive to climate change, we have to protect them, which is why you see the government pushing on mangrove rehabilitation projects. This is why you see the government pushing in terms of protecting coral reef, and we are supporting several NGOs and others that are doing the scientific work to see how we can grow coral reef, even in the labs, which is why you see us advancing our 3 million trees in 3 years, and not just planting trees, but protecting spaces. I don't think any administration has effectively identified as much protected areas as we have. We recently protected, what was it, Black River? Black River. So there has to be an ongoing collaboration and cross-fertilization between the scientific bodies that provide that empirical information for us on both biodiversity and climate change, so that we can provide comprehensive, accurate, and up-to-date information to make the right decisions as policymakers, in terms of the policies that we design and the legislation that we promulgate. One example of this is the recent collaboration between the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in producing what we now call a 2021 Biodiversity and Climate Change publication, linking those two very critical areas and find a way to use the information, the evidence rather, to help us define the best steps for the future. In an effort to significantly reduce our risk and vulnerability to natural disasters, it is going to be important for us to increase resilience and the robustness of critical ecosystems, particularly the coastal and the marine ecosystems, such as I said, mangroves and coral reefs, and we're doing so. Additionally, terrestrial, which is on land, ecosystems such as forest can significantly aid in sequestration of carbon dioxide emissions. What does that mean, Minister? So plants that are in the forest, when you went to primary school, you were taught, we as human beings, we need what to live? There's no one in the class. What we need to live? Oxygen. Right. I'm a teacher too, Mr. Guthrie. So we need oxygen to live. So when we take in oxygen, we emit carbon dioxide. What do the plants need to live? Carbon dioxide. And when they take in the carbon dioxide, what do they emit? Oxygen. Is God telling us that we are connected? It's a simple process, you know. It's a circle. And it goes around. So what happens if we kill off the plants who are providing the oxygen? Who are we ultimately killing? Ourselves. That's it. Everything is connected and it is all a circle. That's why you hear circle of life. The application of nature-based solutions and the resulting climate change mitigation and adaptation co-benefits cannot then be discounted. And so I want to take the opportunity to highlight, as I close off, Jamaica's endorsement of two country-led biodiversity initiatives. Firstly, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which is an intergovernmental group of countries co-chaired by Costa Rica and France, and by the United Kingdom as the Ocean co-chair. The HAC champions a global deal for nature and people with the central goal of protecting at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. And this global target aims to halt the accelerating loss of species and protect vital ecosystems that are the source of our economic security. Political leaders that are participating in the UN Summit on Biodiversity in September 2020 representing 93 countries from all regions, and the European Union. And they have committed to reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. The second is the Global Ocean Alliance, which aims to protect, again, at least 30% of the global oceans in marine protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures by 2030. Now, why are we setting all of these targets? And what am I talking about when I say we're protecting the ocean? Because what I find, PS, is when we speak about protecting the ocean, human beings don't connect it to protecting human beings. They align it with persons who are just environmentalists or activists or tree huggers or ocean lovers or whatever name they want to call. Because we have not properly informed, or people have not informed themselves of the connectivity between protecting 30% of our oceans and protecting what is in the ocean, which we need to eat, to live, to enjoy. So at the first Global Ocean Summit, Jamaica committed to expanding our protected area network by 2% with the declaration of Black River and Pedro Keys and surrounding waters as protected areas under law. And we have done Black River, and we're now finalizing the first and working assiduously, finalizing Black River and working assiduously on Pedro Keys. Also, as part of the commitment, my ministry is working on the Keys management policy for Jamaica. In the next Global Environment Facility replenishment, which is basically in the next phase of money that's giving out to countries like Jamaica and others, right, Ms. Guthrie? We will also be pursuing a number of priority projects, including further exploring the operationalization of the payment for ecosystem services. And this is one of the key deliverables which came out of the recently concluded Yalas Hope Integrated Water Management Project. And it's important because we have to find ways to incentivize people. Not everybody who hears what I'm saying now is going to say, wow, Minister, I agree. Some people may not care much about it. So we want people to be incentivized and find a way to get them involved in transferring what they're doing now into a more sustainable livelihood. All right, 2 more seconds. And we want to look forward to also strengthening our partnerships, strengthening our collaboration towards an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity. But I want to leave you with this quote from Monaco's Prince Albert, who said, "It is together that we will be able to save our biodiversity." This is a principle of effectiveness, but it is also a principle of humility. None of us can act alone. And I want you to think on that and understand the critical nature of how interconnected we are. I want to wish you all a successful and informative conference, and may you all leave with the insight on the critical benefits of preserving and conserving our biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Charles Jr. We can see that you're well prepared by CTD Gillian Guthrie, who is in my mind the foremost authority on environmental management and policy in the public sector. But Minister, we also saw your science training background, twin with your legal training, and no, I didn't know about the teaching. Coming to the fore, but you preach a better sermon than me. And Minister, we thank you for your address. I hope the participants found it inspiring and also recognize that we have work to do. We can't sit back. We have work to do. Thank you very much, Minister Charles Jr. We will now have a performance by Mr. Rolando Williams. Welcome, Mr. Williams.
Plastic run me down, drinks buckle, drinks straw. Plastic from the bone, foam box, foam plate, and the foam cup. If them can't recycle, then repurpose. Uno people take garbage man for your scapegoat. You think if you're no litter, me nah no walk. I call pan my name when something block your dream, but when you check it out, you are the one forget the blame. Clean it up. Nobody mess up the place, clean it up. Plastic take a while for degrade, clean it up. Do nobody mess it up, clean it. Me I beg you clean it up. Bamboo. At the rival for steel, might just use it to serve the next meal. It grow anyway, except in a cold weather. But we're alright, we're living in a hot temperature. Banana leaf. Great for packaging, unwrap the blue draw, see the steam rising. Reduce plastic and start wrap with it. It degradable, and no problem for dash where it clean it up. Nobody mess up the place, clean it up. Plastic, our grace, clean it up. Do nobody mess it up, clean it. Me I beg you clean it up. Clean up the harbors for beautiful seas. Build a blue economy. Protect the species. Plant some trees. Reduce CO2 for me and you. Trees give we food, shelter, tools, and wood. So if you treat them good, just keep it clean. People, just clean it up. Just clean it up. Clean it up. Nobody mess up the place. Clean it up. Plastic take a while for degrade. Clean it up. Do. You're not for mess it up. Clean it. Me I beg you clean it up. Clean it up. You're not for mess up the place. Clean it up. Clean it up. Please. You're not for mess it up. Clean it. Me I beg you. Clean it up.
Thank you very much, Ronaldo. That was well done. And it also speaks to Ms. Guthrie, our policy decisions and policy instruments that have been taken over the years to clean it up and to give us a better environment and to conserve our biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Dr. Shaba Maharaj. And I'll just like to say a few words about Dr. Maharaj. Dr. Shaba Maharaj is a graduate of the University of the West Indies with a Bachelor of Science double major in Zoology and Botany honors and an MPhil in Environmental Biology honors, who then went on to obtain a doctorate from the University of Oxford, looking at impacts of climate change upon biodiversity within small island states. Dr. Maharaj has spent the last 12 years in a combination of research and practitioner roles focused on climate impacts, sustainable nature-based adaptation and mitigation strategies across biodiversity hotspots at both global and regional scales. In the Caribbean, her work has been largely centered around projecting climate impacts upon biodiversity and protecting protected area planning with heavy focus on risks, vulnerability, and climate adaptation and mitigation, especially within the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. Her work seeks to inform and augment existing conservation strategies in order to increase the natural, adaptive, and resilient capacities of Caribbean nations. And some of this work has been integrated into updated national policies in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll just read a sentence at the global scale. She's one of 50 international scientists who produced the recently released IPBES IPPC report on biodiversity and climate change and is currently serving her second IPPC assessment report. The upcoming AR6 working group. Dr. Maharaj, her greatest concern for biodiversity conservation, especially in response to changing climate within the Caribbean and other island nations, is a chronic paucity of data, and I quote her. The lack of dialogue on this issue continues to perpetuate this paucity and hinders our capacity to develop the robust assessments and projections needed to effectively increase our adaptive and resilience potentials. End of quote. Welcome. We will now welcome Dr. Maharaj.
Good morning, everyone. I will be talking to you today about biodiversity loss under changing climate conditions within a Caribbean context. As a native of the Caribbean, and especially as someone who has spent the better part of the last decade or so researching around this theme, I am truly delighted to be able to speak to you on this topic today. Because I honestly believe that with time, this is going to become more and more important to the people of the Caribbean as they go about their daily lives. So we have two phenomena that we're talking about. On the one hand, we're talking about biodiversity loss, and on the other hand, we're talking about climate change. These two phenomena are happening as we speak, right before our very eyes. I'm sure we've all heard about this, but both of them, but what do we really understand about them? And more importantly, how they could impact our lives. So I think that this would be best explained if I were to paint you two potential pictures or scenarios, if you will. So as global temperatures continue to increase with climate change, we have scenario A on the one hand, where we go about as business as usual. So we do not improve on and better integrate climate change into our conservation strategies. As a result, biodiversity loss continues at an increasing rate. And this is likely to cause the degradation of our ecosystems and the services that they provide for us. Therefore, for example, our rivers and our reservoirs may start running low or become dry. Our corals will continue to suffer from pollution, and this may directly impact our livelihoods, the livelihoods of our fisherfolk or tourism, the mainstay of so many of our economies. The symphony of life teeming within our forests might eventually become silent as more and more species die off. And as the Minister Purnell indicated, with all of these things culminating, it's going to become more and more difficult and costly for our governments to ensure basic necessities, such as potable water, livelihoods from fishing and tourism, public health and infrastructure, food security, and the list goes on and on. So that's scenario A. Scenario B, we do decide to act now as a region to preserve our biodiversity. We do update our existing conservation strategies to include climate change on a much bigger scale. And if we do this well enough, this will enable us to manage our biodiversity loss. There will be some changes. Some species will become lost, but the overall integrity of our ecosystems will be maintained. And as a result, the beautiful diversity of life within our natural areas will continue. The ecosystem services that we depend on will not become broken. And so our streams, our reservoirs will not run dry. Tourism will not wither away, as we will actively find ways to continue replenishing our coral reefs and use other cutting-edge technology. And when you walk down to the beach, you will still be able to see the fishermen pulling in their catch at the end of the day. And the tourists walking into our forest will still be awestruck by the grand symphony of sound that comes from the diversity of life therein. So I should say, though, as a disclaimer, I'm not suggesting that these two scenarios are set in stone. No, they are simply two of a range of scenarios that could happen. What happens in the future all depends on what we do now moving forward. But if we want to try to achieve something close to scenario B, then there are some basic facts with respect to biodiversity loss and climate change that we need to understand and accept. First of all, no matter what we do, things will change. For example, some species will be lost, but how much species become lost depends on what actions we take now moving forward. And secondly, a golden rule: mitigation buys time for adaptation. As small islands, we are extremely vulnerable to climate change. And so we need as much time for adaptation as possible, which means that we cannot and should not ignore any opportunities for climate mitigation. And thirdly, in order to achieve the best possible outcome, we must stop working in silos. We can achieve so much more working together as a region instead of as individual island nations. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the pervading fact remains that climate change does not and will never observe geopolitical boundaries. On the world stage, we have already come together as one voice. For example, with CARICOM, if we can apply a similar unity towards managing biodiversity in the face of climate change, we have a very good chance of achieving some semblance of the scenario B I just described. As part of the research I've been doing over the last several years, I've been looking at how climate change impacts biodiversity across our region as a whole rather than on individual islands. And from what I can tell, though, this conversation hasn't yet been actively established as part of the overall regional narrative. And so I would like to begin that conversation here with you today. One of the first questions that I think we should ask is, how is biodiversity being impacted by climate change in general across the world? In a nutshell, basically, species are shifting. They're tracking cooler conditions, which means that they're either moving from the tropics towards the poles, so northwards or southwards, depending on where you are on the equator, as well as from lowlands to uplands in the mountains, where it's cooler. And what about within the Caribbean? So did you know that the Caribbean is not just one of the global biodiversity hotspots, but it is actually one of the hottest global biodiversity hotspots in existence? But we are also unfortunately classified as one of the most vulnerable, because it is estimated that we stand to lose a lot more species due to non-climatic activities such as deforestation and pollution than some of the other hotspots. And these numbers were actually generated before climate change was a thing. So now these numbers are actually higher because of changing climate. Within our marine territories, what is happening is that the species that can are moving northwards from our tropical waters to the temperate seas and oceans. And those species that cannot move, they have two choices. They can either adapt to the warming conditions or they die. And on land, unlike on continents, most of the species within our islands are landlocked. So they can't just simply migrate north when things heat up. And so they also have a choice. Well, they have choices. Either they migrate from the lowlands to the highlands, where it's cooler, or they adapt to the new warming conditions, or they die. But unlike within our seas, many of these land species can't just simply migrate up the mountains. Why? Because for them to navigate from the lowlands to the highlands, they need to cross an intricate network of human activities like intensive agriculture, urban settlements in general, infrastructure. And so it's very difficult for these species to find refuge within the mountains. And also the other question is, how will this combination of climate change and biodiversity loss affect us as island inhabitants? The main message coming out of the recently released IPBES IPCC report on biodiversity and climate change is very clear. A sustainable society requires both stabilized climate and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. One simply cannot exist without the other. You see, both biodiversity and climate change are closely interconnected, and both of them are driven by human activities. Historically, it was the non-climate drivers like the pollution and the deforestation that were driving biodiversity loss. But what we've seen in the recent years is that climate change is now being added to the mix, and so it's having a multiplier effect. It's exacerbating the already negative effects that are being created by the deforestation, etc. And at the same time, while all of this is happening, us humans across the world continue to pour more fuel into the fire. And so we are, by increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. It is a vicious circle that has developed and that is continuing. So, and the main take home from this is that with all of this happening, the biodiversity and the ecosystems, and remember, we are also part of that, of the ecosystems within our islands, are amongst the most vulnerable. We are already being disproportionately affected in some places. And this is because small islands are small, fixed places of land. There is no way, there's no place to turn to when things go bad. So these small islands, they host us as humans and everything that comes with us, our settlement, our agriculture, our infrastructure. And they also host a natural habitat containing the biodiversity, which provides ecosystem services, which are essential if we as the humans on these islands are to continue life as we know it. You see, because our islands are so small, everything is more closely and tightly interconnected than it would be, say, for example, if we were living on a continent. There is much less buffering between humans and the natural environment. What we do to the environment quickly impacts on biodiversity in one form or another. And these impacts are building up and are now becoming exacerbated by climate change. At some point, with the increased warming, this is going to become too much for our ecosystems to handle. And as a result, the functioning of these ecosystems will become impaired. And this will impact negatively the delivery of these key ecosystem services that we depend on. And honestly, that a lot of us just take for granted. Why? Because they're always there. They've always been there. So they're sort of invisible to us. But the fact is, if this happens, it will threaten our way of life. It's going to affect, just to begin with, the provision of basic necessities, such as locally sourced food, potable water, protection from disease, livelihoods, food security, and the list goes on and on. So what can we do? The science is very clear. If we are to preserve the integrity of our biodiversity, we must all, on the one hand, adapt and also mitigate. Now, let me be clear. Things will change. We should harbor no illusions that we are somehow going to be able to preserve all of the species and ecosystems exactly as they are now. No, this is not going to happen. Some species will be lost. Some natural communities will change. And it would be counterproductive, maladaptive, and even potentially destructive for us to try to keep things exactly as they are now. This is because ecosystems like you and I are living systems. We naturally try to adjust and adapt when we're placed in an unhealthy or an uncomfortable situation. So instead, our challenge is to find ways to facilitate the adjustment of our ecosystems to changing climate, all the while maintaining the overall integrity of our ecosystems so that they don't collapse. And this, ladies and gentlemen, requires new ways of thinking. So for the rest of this talk, I'm not going to go into the minute details of how particular conservation strategies could be changed, because this is a very long list and it's very context specific, and the time here is limited. So what I would like to do instead is briefly touch on some of the overarching issues that must be addressed before we can truly have any chance of effectively making change to conservation strategies on the ground. In other words, I would like to focus on the forest instead of the trees for this talk. So the first major point that comes to mind is that we must remove the silos. As I said before, climate change does not recognize geopolitical boundaries. So instead of just only having island-based conservation strategies, why not develop in parallel regional conservation strategies, aiming to increase the adaptive and resilience capacities of biodiversity to climate change for the region as a whole? The first example that comes to mind is the establishment of a regional protected area network for both marine and terrestrial environments. This would require us to act together as one region, pooling our resources and our skills together. And there are so many benefits that could be gained. For example, access to increased resources, sharing of data, sharing and building up capacity, and the ubiquitizing of skills across our region without having to source from the outside. A wonderful example of such an collaboration is that is taking place within the Coral Triangle Initiative, where this is a multilateral partnership that was formed in 2007 by the president of Indonesia among the 6 nations within the Coral Triangle. They basically established a large integrated zoning across these 6 countries, and which developed into a fully functioning and effectively managed region-wide marine protection system. This is a living, breathing system where work is ongoing, constantly improving on the management, the effectiveness, the design of this protected area system, and also includes other activities such as regeneration and replenishment of and restoration of their mangrove forests, of their coral reefs, etc. And you know what? This has yielded reciprocal benefits with respect to climate change and biodiversity. On the one hand, biodiversity is being maintained and is robust. And this has basically resulted in it protecting the coastlines and the people that live on the coast from the impacts of climate change, which is, for example, with respect to storms. And there are also lots of other benefits that they've been yielding. And just bear with me a moment while I try to share my slides showing you some of these. So as you can see, there's a long list of other multiple benefits that they have gained from this, such as coastal livelihoods thriving, poverty being reduced along the coast, and continuous mitigation of pollution. And so some critical questions that we must ask to actively update our existing conservation strategies, if we would like to achieve this scenario B, would be, as a region or even as individual island nation states, do we know which species are likely to disappear as climate continues to warm? And if yes, how will these extinctions or migrations ultimately impact our livelihoods, our economies, our way of life? Let's use some real examples. For example, do we know how, when, and where our commercial fisheries will migrate to? And what are these fisheries going to be replaced by? Are there other fisheries that are coming in? Also, with respect to the present fish nurseries along our coastal waters, which are extremely temperature sensitive, will these be able to survive the increasing temperatures as our waters warm? If not, how is this going to affect our fisher folk, our food prices, the economy as a whole, and in the longer term, human well-being and health? Another example, what is going to happen if our economies if our coral reefs die off? What should we do to try to sustain our coral reefs, which, by the way, still faces major disruptions due to pollution? Should we be considering making more integrated into our conservation strategies, coral restoration, replenishment, and other cutting-edge technologies if we are to try to keep our tourism industry alive into the future? These are just a few examples of questions. And this brings me to my next point. As far as I know, there is no regional nexus for climate change impacts, adaptation, mitigation, and resilience research. No active, and active being the key word here, there's no active Caribbean focal point for the efficient collection and dissemination of such critical information that is needed for policy and intersectoral use across the Caribbean. And the ironic thing is that all across the Caribbean, there are scientists quietly working away on relevant themes. Here alone in Jamaica, and there are so many scientists working on similar themes. And the list that you see before you is just a small sampling of that. Special mention should be made of the physical climate modeling team at the UV and MONA for their wonderful service of providing baseline climate data, as you see within the State of the Jamaica climate reports. And I'm told that the updated version is due at the end of this year, so not long from now. And then there is also the UWI's Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilient Development that was recently launched a few weeks ago, I think in October. Could this be part of the development of such a nexus? You see, ladies and gentlemen, it's not like we don't have the knowledge or the research or the infrastructure. It's just perhaps that, we haven't been spending much time looking at the forests, and we've been spending a lot more time looking at the trees. So if we were to step back a bit and look at everything together and create such a nexus, just imagine the impact and the acceleration of progress that could come with such a development. And so to make my next point, here are 4 graphs of Jamaica, 4 maps of Jamaica. They represent Jamaica's ability to support biodiversity under different warming conditions, 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 degrees Celsius. This information was kindly provided by Professor Jeff Price of the Tyndall Institute, the Tyndall Center at the University of East Anglia. And he generated this working together with colleagues at the James Cook University in Australia. So what you see here is that these dark green areas, they show you areas of the island under different warming conditions that will support, that will not lose as much biodiversity. It will lose only about 0 to 25%. Whereas these red areas here, they show you areas that are expected to lose between 75 to 100% of the existing biodiversity. So if I was a protected areas planner or a manager, this sort of information is critical because this is what I need in order to develop conservation strategies that will take my country forward into the future and in order for us to adapt to climate change. So 2 things that stand out to me, and for example, let me give you 2 examples. If I say as a protected areas planner, I wanted to develop more protected areas on this island, or I wanted to find out where should I restore the natural habitat. I would look at the green areas that remain. So for example, here or here, the last, after the completion of the COP26, it is expected that if all promises are kept, global temperatures should rise to about 2.4 degrees by the end of the century. That would take us somewhere between this map and this map here. So if I wanted to establish a protected area, I would probably look here because this is being maintained between both of these maps. Also, another thing that is clear from these maps is that the protected areas, which you see outlined here in the black lines, they are not going to be able to support biodiversity alone. It becomes very, very clear that if we are serious about conserving biodiversity, we will have to include not just state, but non-state actors. So it will be critical and essential to involve both public and private actors, as well as community involvement. This is absolutely essential if we are to move forward and to conserve our biodiversity. The last thing that I would like to mention about this, these maps is that these maps were generated using 50 square kilometer data. Now, 50 square kilometers, this is okay for Jamaica because Jamaica is one of the larger islands within the Caribbean. But if we were to try to use these 50 square kilometer data to say develop the same kind of maps for many islands in the Eastern Caribbean, such as Grenada, St. Kitts, Nevis, Carriacou, Barbados, this would not work because it's too big. The data is too coarse. And this brings me to my other point. We don't have enough data. We don't have adequately downscale data to develop such projections for most of the smaller islands within the Caribbean. What we require ideally is sub 5 kilometer square data. There is a chronic and virtually this One thing, but there are other gases like methane that we produce from our livestock, or nitrous oxides that are produced when we apply fertilizers to our crops. These are even more potent warming gases. And I know for a fact, by talking to farmers across the Caribbean, there is no control, there's no data, there's no baseline in terms of how much fertilizer is being applied to our crops, and therefore how much nitrous oxides we emit. These are some things to take into consideration and think about as we move forward. So, in ending, I mean, what I would like to say today, in essence, is that yes, time is almost out. We must act now if we are to have any hope of managing our biodiversity loss into the future. And this requires parallel acting. So both at the small island scale as well as the regional scales. But we're not yet at the point today where we say, oh no, all is lost with our biodiversity, it's too late, we've lost it. No, there is still some time left. What we do now, what we do in the next months and few years perhaps, has the potential to make the world of difference. It will decide how much we lose and what we end up with. But we must hurry and we must respond together as one. We must come together now. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Wave, which has been shared as our most recent body of work. Let's put our hands together and welcome Olive Senior.
I see my land. Some of you might consider poetry as pretty useless, but especially at a time like this, at a time of crisis in the world, what we have seen is how poetry can be an agent of transformation. mainly because from the point of view of the writer or the reader, it operates at a personal level, and the personal is where change really begins. I hope to encourage young people especially to really see my land, to become more aware of nature and the environment, not as an abstract idea, but as something happening up close and personal. What you see outside your door, in your yard, in your school, your city street, your riverside, or your roadside. And then to encourage the reading and writing of poetry as a way of talking about and taking responsibility for this environment. I believe the awakening to consciousness really begins with this intimate way of seeing. And this is what we hope to encourage with our programs. We will be working with other cultural workers, with schools and organizations to get the message home. I regret that there's no time to give you any details, but we are well aware that we cannot do this without a partnership with our scientists and our environmentalists, because it is your knowledge that will have to guide us. So I look forward to our finding ways of engaging with each other. And I can be contacted through the National Library of Jamaica, which is the home of the Poet Laureate. Science provides information and answers, but poetry is what touches the individual heart. And I do believe that in this environmental crisis that we all face, we will need to fully engage both hearts and minds. To end, I would like to read a brief piece of poetry that demonstrates more than anything how a personal and intimate connection with the land, how living in harmony with nature can become a part of our personal and national identity and stay with us forever, no matter how long we live or how far we roam. I have chosen the words of the little country boy from Clarendon, Jamaica, Claude McKay, who traveled the world and achieved lasting international fame. But when his thoughts turned back to the Jamaican homeland to which he never returned, it was always in the harmony of the land he left behind that he found solace. In wishing you success with your deliberations, I will leave you with McKay's perhaps little-known poem, a very brief one called Bananas Ripe and Green, and he's standing in front of a store window in New York City, gazing at bananas ripe and green, and ginger root, cocoa in pods, and alligator pears, and tangerines and mangoes and grapefruit, fit for the highest prize at parish fairs. Set in the window, bringing memories of fruit trees laden by low-singing rills, and dewy dawns and mystical blue skies in benediction. Dim, and I could no more gaze. A wave of longing through my body swept, and hungry for the old familiar ways, I turned aside and bowed my head and wept. Thank you, and wishing you much success with your deliberations.
Thank you very much, Poet Laureate Senior, and we enjoyed your presentation. Now, there is no time for any additional comments except for me to thank you all for joining us. I sincerely hoped that you enjoyed the opening ceremony. I think it has thrown the planning team's schedule off track, but we want to thank all the persons who made remarks, our guest speaker, Dr. Maharaj, our Poet Laureate, and all I'd like to say in closing is that we have to move beyond the talk. The science is ahead of the policy, and the policy is ahead of implementation. Let's get to implementation to conserve our biodiversity. Thank you all. Have a good day.